Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you and to introduce this event, a lecture by Professor Donna Dickenson. Judith is going to say more about our distinguished guest, so let me just say a few words on behalf of the university. My name is Katalin Farkas. I'm the Provost and Academic Director of the university. As many of you will know, Central European University is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year for about 18 months, I think. We are taking a 1.5 year to, it's an extra long anniversary. This anniversary year is a very good occasion to reflect on the nature of the university and on the values that the university especially endorses. And I think we are very fortunate here because Professor Dickinson's work and her topic today are very close to the values that are very dear to CEU's heart in a number of different ways. One thing is that it's a remarkable body of work in being related to many different disciplines, and these are disciplines that we have also at this university. So, in a description of her recent book, it is said that this work encompasses philosophy, law, healthcare ethics, global politics, feminism, history, poetry, literature, bioethics. Almost all of these fields are covered by CEU, one or other CEU program. And of course, one of the things that interests us especially is a joint work among these different disciplines, is a perspective that exploits different insights coming from these disciplines. Another CEU value that you actually find in the official strategic plan of the university that we're drafting now is a commitment to the openness in the field of ideas, promoting critical thinking, encouraging the pursuit of truth wherever it may lead, resolving differences through debate, not denial, self-reflection, and taking the possible theoretical and practical consequences into consideration. And I just started to read Professor Dickinson's book, Body Shopping, and it's a fantastic example of all these values. I mean, these are very difficult questions that she's asking in this book. They're questions that have to be asked, and it seems to me that the way to answer these questions is indeed through painstaking analysis, the very careful and considered use of empirical evidence, and a commitment to pursuing inquiry wherever it may lead, even if it sometimes ends up in positions that are unusual or less popular. And I'd like to mention a third CEU value, which is a special commitment to the integration of theory and practice, and that is also obviously something very important in Professor Dickinson's work. When I just greeted her, I told her, being a philosopher myself, that it's especially gratifying to see when philosophical ideas have a direct relevance into certain fields of practice. So whatever we're talking about here obviously will have major policy implications, major way of influencing the way we think about categories that shape our lives. So I'm very, very pleased to have this lecture here today, because I think it's an excellent and incredibly exciting and very important area that Professor Dickinson is representing, and I think any university would be very lucky to have her, but I think it's especially something that suits CEU's values and interests very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear Professor Donna Dickenson, Provost colleagues, students and guests, on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Central European University, or Center for Ethics and Law in Biomedicine, wishes to contribute also the celebration of our institution by organizing bioethics lecture series with distinguished speakers. This lecture series focuses on ethical, legal, and social challenges to new scientific advances in the field of biomedicine, The commercialization and commodification of the human body are at the core of ethical debates that engage a large range of disciplines, even outside of the life sciences. Today, we shall discuss the ethical and legal implications of egg sale and how oocyte market is developing time to time different parts of the world. Should we worry about the commodification or commercialization on the human body? Should we keep or modify the ethical and legal framework in Europe or elsewhere? Should we make more nuanced legal distinctions in the international level or leave for the domestic regulations the details? The Oviedo Convention imposes a categorical ban on the commercialization of any part of the human body. Its Article 21 specifically stipulates that human body and its parts shall not as such give rise to financial gain. The Convention enjoys widespread support among European countries, as already 27 countries have ratified it. However, when we reach the field of reproductive and regenerative medicine, it poses very new challenges to this principle. Recently, human eggs are increasingly needed for the stem cell research. When somatic cell nuclear transfer, CSNT, appeared in the late 1990s, it reinforced concern among even family scholars about the emergence of new biotech industry that will rely on large quantities of human oocytes and bring about the problematic commodifications of women's gametes and body, or it may create even new forms of women's exploitation. Payment for egg donation is a challenging question, as egg donation requires substantial contribution from women. It is not only genetic contribution, but it may involve diminished reproductive chances as well as physical suffering at risk that hormonal stimulations and egg retrieval would demand. Though spare eggs may be accessed in the course of IVF treatment, still the fact remains that human eggs are not unlimited resources, and harvesting human eggs includes several physical and psychological commitments. Harvesting human eggs requires, for instance, the hormonal treatment and difficult procedures. The European ban on financial gain, as it's stated in the Oviedo Convention, is applicable to this domain, but in practice, the prohibition involves divergent applications on sperm and oocyte donation. Furthermore, several alterations from this core norm can be envisaged across countries. Egg sharing, loyalty programs, egg allocation, economic incentives are used under different names in different countries and different clinics. In UK, egg sharing programs are often seen as labeled and benefits in kind. And for instance, as HFE has approved egg sharing, they stated that outright payment for donation is not allowed by the law in the UK. But for instance, in Spain, we also face very complicated situation, as payment for egg donation is prohibited by the law, but in a lower level legal norm specifies some payments that was recognized as a cost for inconvenience. So the topic of today's anniversary lecture poses so far unsettled questions in the intersection of gender, law, and bioethics. And we do like this combination at the center of ethics and law in biomedicine. The lecture today, entitled Exploitation and Choice in the Global Egg Trade, Emotive Terminology or Necessary Critique. We are very privileged to have Professor Donna Dickenson here, who is an emeritus professor of medical ethics and humanities at the University of London, research associate at the University of Oxford, and visiting fellow at the University of Bristol. Over 40 years career in the academia, she published more than 20 books and 60 refereed articles in several fields of medical ethics and medical law. In 2006, she was the first woman who won the International Spinoza Lens Awards for her contribution to public debate on ethics. She's currently working on 2 books on very contemporary issues, an introduction to bioethics in a novel medium of e-book and iPad app, and a popular science book for a Columbia University Press titled Me Medicine, Reclaiming Biotechnology for the Common Good. A previous book, which is perhaps known to the general audience, is tackling the issues, property issues of the human body parts, titled Body Shopping, Converting Body Parts to Profit, and it was published with great success in 2009. So we're very happy to have Donna Dickenson here, and we are all very much looking forward to her presentation in this very exciting and up-to-date topic. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the Central European University for inviting me here. I haven't been to Budapest in 36 years. That does date me, I know. And there are tremendous changes, which I find very exciting. Thank you very much to Professor Sandor and Professor Farkas for that wonderful introduction. And I'm very pleased that the ideals that you have here of multidisciplinarity are also things that are quite close to me. So I'm looking forward to our discussion after my talk. Right. Okay. I want to begin with a slide which gives you some idea of the extent of the global egg trade. And this is the phenomenon which is sometimes called reproductive tourism. Some analysts don't like that title, but I think it actually has its uses. So you can see the extent of the trade. For example, although, as Judith said, it is actually illegal in the United Kingdom to purchase eggs, there are fairly well substantiated rumours that a clinic in Moscow has been supplying a particular UK clinic with frozen eggs. In Latin America, if you go on the web, you'll find a huge number of egg clinics throughout Latin America, particularly Chile, Mexico, and Argentina, and Peru to a certain extent. These are mainly serving US and European buyers, and there is a tremendous growth in the level of sale. If you look under the phrase baby on safari, you'll find it actually mentioned in the official South African government tour guide, so that you can go to South Africa, have your safari and your baby at the same time. So they claim. The incidence in India, I think, is quite interesting. At the moment, there is a bill before the Indian Parliament to legalize surrogacy, commercialized surrogacy, whereby Western couples come and purchase the services of an Indian surrogate mother. This would be the first law in the world which enforces what is called in law specific performance. That is, the mother must surrender the baby by law. That's like no other commercial contract in the world. If I hire Judith to paint my house and she decides she doesn't want to, she just has to return the money. She doesn't actually have to get up there on the ladder and start painting. But in this Indian law, the mother will actually be required by law or face criminal penalties to surrender the baby. There is also trade in eggs. And when we were recently in Kerala, in a place called Thiruvarakalam, we passed a shop front, a very small shop front, which had a sign, Holy Family Diagnostics, Complete Lab and Egg Services. Now, if you realise that Kerala is 25% Christian, you can see the appeal of that title, Holy Family Diagnostics. So there is a trade in eggs in India, and it's a highly commercialised one. The question then is whether this trade should be regulated. In Argentina, the clinics actually are quite unregulated. They often guarantee pregnancy. This is medically, actually, I think probably impossible, but it does mean that they must be using very high and probably dangerous levels of hormone stimulation for the egg donors. And that is borne out by the fact that the average number of fertilized embryos implanted is 4 in these clinics. That is dangerous, actually. It's twice the maximum recommended in the UK. It's 4 times the level recommended in Scandinavia. And if a quadruple pregnancy ensues, then obviously they're dangerous for the mother. There is no statutory regulation in Argentina. There are only professional guidelines. The clinic's advertising uses the analogy of the Big Mac. It says, well, a McDonald's hamburger is half the price in Argentina. Wouldn't you rather come here for your McDonald's? Wouldn't you rather come here for your eggs? Neatly comparing women to cattle. There are people in the audience who probably know more than I do about the Romanian egg trade, but I recently heard a lecture by Michal Norman, who has done an extensive study of the trade between Israel and Romania. Because of Israel's very strong pronatalist policy, which is, of course, intended to build up the Israeli population in respect of the Palestinian population, It therefore has the highest IVF spending per capita in the developed world, and it has very liberal regulation. The only specific provision which is strict regulation is that as of last year, Israeli women are no longer allowed to sell their eggs abroad because their eggs are a precious resource for the country. But Israeli couples have traveled to Romania to buy eggs cheaply from Romanian women. Women there are paid about $200 for 20 to 30 oocytes, which is 2 to 5 times the average female monthly salary, from clinics with very poor hygiene and some really horrific stories of what happens there. Very high markup and very little regulation. The EC Tissue Directive of 2004 now includes Romania as an accession country, and it does, like the Oviedo Convention, forbid payment for eggs used in IVF. It says nothing about eggs used in somatic cell nuclear transfer research. But it does allow expenses to be interpreted at the national level, and as Judith said, this has been interpreted in Spain so as to allow payment of up to 1,200 euros, which is a sufficient inducement, I think, which could count as an inducement to sale for women from non-EC countries. The UK has had an extensive consultation on this. It's very obvious that our HFEA does want to pay and that it has trouble getting around the prohibition on egg sale. And it looks very likely that the UK will want to interpret expenses very liberally when it makes its announcement on what will follow from the consultation in December. Okay, so throughout these examples, which is really just intended to set the scene, we're looking at the issue of can't regulate or won't regulate. As the global trade in human eggs continues to expand with logarithmic momentum, it's frequently argued that we couldn't regulate it even if we wanted to. And of course, not all commentators do want to regulate it. Many view regulation as counterproductive. So that, for example, it's been suggested that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, governance in the US, which is actually fairly liberal, has had the perverse effect of increasing levels of reproductive tourism by US citizens to Latin America. Now, I really want to tackle this argument about whether people say it can't be regulated or should not be regulated as I begin this talk. Some examples of this so-called pragmatic style of argument, which I'm sure many of you have already heard. This argument is common to people on both sides, left and right, of the political spectrum. So, for example, some commentators assert that baby markets, which would comprise egg sale, surrogacy, and paid adoption, are so firmly established that prohibiting or regulating them merely salves our collective conscience, makes us feel better, but amounts to no more than hypocritical pretense. And others say that the burgeoning demand for eggs simply makes even an honest attempt to regulate unrealistic, that people will always find a way around regulations, so why try? This is a terrible argument. Regulating murder is also a lost cause. People will always try to kill each other. We don't normally think that's a very strong argument in favor of abolishing laws against homicide. Okay, why not? I think what's hiding here is a value judgment. That is, people who take that view that we can't regulate really are saying we shouldn't regulate, I think, in my view. So while we almost all agree, I think we can all agree, that murder is a bad thing, not everyone agrees that egg sale is a bad thing. We, of course, may disagree about who counts as a person, and that's where the abortion debates come in, which I don't intend to go into. But I think we generally agree that if someone is a person, it's wrong to kill them. Now, can't regulate in that case, I think, is a covert expression of won't regulate. So what I have noted here, however, is that those who argue in favour of markets in tissue, that is, who say they don't want to regulate, I think they are correct in one aspect. And that's the aspect of altruism and profit. That is, those who favour markets very often say, well, in the countries that ban the sale of eggs and other tissue, only donors are expected to act altruistically. Everyone else can make a profit. So the IVF clinic can make a profit, or the egg broker can make a profit. The tissue broker can make a profit, and the biotechnology firms that supply the drugs can make a profit. So one way altruism does equal exploitation. I have made that argument elsewhere in my work. Therefore, isn't it the obvious thing to allow everybody to make a profit, including the donors? Well, no, it's not actually the obvious thing. That is the usual move. The usual move is to conclude from that one-way altruism that no one should be expected to act altruistically. But we could just as easily conclude the other way. We could conclude that everyone should be expected to act altruistically. And the argument itself, the argument from one-way altruism, doesn't tell you which way to jump. It seems to me that those who think that you can't defy the market actually are relying on other implicit assumptions. That is, that it's impractical to run a system in which everyone is expected to be altruistic, or that markets will inevitably undermine a not-for-profit system. But I think there are counterexamples to that. I think they're wrong, actually, when they say that there is no alternative. For example, the US blood system, which at the time of Richard Titmus's book in 1971, The Gift Relationship, was very much commercialized and was also dangerous because it was so highly commercialized that the only people who were willing to sell their blood, and most blood was bought and sold, were mostly addicts. And therefore there was a very high rate of hepatitis B. That US blood collection since Titmus's book has actually moved in the direction of a more altruistic system. The UK system has become less altruistic, but the US system has moved towards greater altruism. France, I think, is also an extremely strong example of the possibility of maintaining the distrust of commodification. Many of you will probably know that the French have just concluded a very lengthy series of debates, both in the legislature and at the popular level, on the latest review of their bioethics laws, which are extremely comprehensive. They cover every aspect of biomedicine. And in this debate, where there was actually quite a lot of debate between the Assembly and the Senate on this, they maintained the attitude which they have maintained since 1983, that is, that there should be no commodification allowed in the system. And while they do suffer some problems of reproductive tourism and egg shortage, they have nevertheless maintained that prohibition, so that, for example, they also don't allow the banking of private umbilical cord blood because they think that undermines general solidarity and undermines the public system. They don't allow commercial surrogacy. They don't really allow any intrusion of cash into this nexus. And they manage. They have managed since 1983, and that was when their the first committee in Europe to deal with healthcare ethics was established in France. Okay. The French actually used the term exploitation in their debates. They remain very much concerned about exploitation of donors. And you can also see this term used elsewhere. For example, the Indian organization SAMA, which is an Indian feminist organization, has said that egg donation should not be legalized as it leads to exploitation of women. And what I want to argue here is that whereas generally I think we think that exploitation is quite an emotive term and are rather distrustful of it. We think it's not an academic term, but it's just, an emotive term. I'm going to argue that exploitation, if properly analysed in a philosophical and legal manner, offers a necessary critique of the global egg trade. And I'm going to define exploitation in 3 different ways in terms of disparity, dignity, and degradation. I'm also going to be arguing that choice is not what philosophers call a knockdown argument, that is, one against which there is no recourse. And I'm going to argue that if anything deserves to be called emotive terminology, it's this blind use of choice. And that will come out in the later stages of my argument. Okay, what I want to begin with, though, is this point which Judith has already touched on, and that is that egg donation constitutes labour. The argument from one-way altruism, the one which says that everyone except the donor is allowed to make a profit, but the donor is expected to be altruistic, does at least have the merit of recognising that what women do in donating eggs is purposeful labour and not just a natural process. In this respect, it is one up on the editorial in Nature, which I saw recently, which said, and I quote, it's badly phrased, "A human egg has no value because it is, quote, just one of those ovulated each month by billions of women and that perish unfertilised." Okay, that's not how eggs are produced for IVF. And anyone who writes for Nature really ought to know better. Okay. So it's a 3-stage process. It first involves injections. The woman has to give herself injections over a lengthy period to suppress her normal cycle. You then have ovarian stimulation to produce extra eggs. There have been reports documented of up to 70 eggs being produced in one cycle. The human female is programmed by nature to produce 1 or 2. You can see the amount of drugs that must be involved to get 70. The woman nearly died, by the way, in that process. And then finally, the eggs have to be extracted, which is an invasive procedure. It's estimated that it takes 60 hours on average to do all of this. So it's not just one egg that perishes every month. It's much more complicated than that. And the drugs that are used and the invasive procedure have in the past been proven to result in fatalities. Okay, so let's go back to this idea then that it's labour. The idea then that there is labour involved is the first step, which I think is quite crucial. This is purposeful work involving a certain level of risk, and therefore this labour could confer a property right. If you've read your Locke, you know that's how Locke gets property rights. Basically, you mix your labour with the substance, so that, for example, if you cultivate a field, you're mixing your labour not only with the seeds, but with the process of working and weeding that field. And that's what entitles you to the produce of the field. That's the idea of mixing one's labour, and I think the same is going on when women give eggs or sell eggs. Marx, in turn, relied on the Lockean notion of property and labour. That's the presupposition in Marx, the notion of the labour theory of value. And in Marx, the classic Marxist analysis of exploitation involves an external standard of disparity, which overrides a subjective interpretation. And that disparity is between the labour value invested in producing something and the price paid for the finished product. And it's entirely possible, therefore, because this is an external standard, for someone to be exploited even if she denies it. I think that's really quite crucial, because we often say, well, they deny they're being exploited, end of the argument. But in a Marxist standard, that's not the end of the argument. There is an external objective standard, and he's not the only one who maintains that. When, for example, Romanian women are paid $200 for a cycle of 20 to 30 eggs, but the clinic sells the fertilized eggs embryos for $3,000, there's obviously a disparity. So that meets the Marxist standard. But again, the women in the study I'm quoting from, which is by a sociologist called Michal Naumann, who studied this in the early part of this century, they denied that they were being exploited. So that's, again, the same difficulty. But it is possible, I would just repeat, for someone to be exploited even if she denies it by this standard. The other interesting thing about a Marxist analysis here is that it has been used by modern sociologists on a global scale. So just as early capitalism and the preceding agrarian revolution, particularly in England, were funded by value in labour and land being taken from displaced peasants, that is, we had the enclosures in England and later in Scotland, which produced the wealth which later funded the industrial revolution. So just as early capitalism and the preceding enclosures were funded by that value, the Australian sociologists Catherine Waldby and Melinda Cooper now identify a systematic transfer of surplus value and reproductivity on a global scale from women selling eggs as the lowest rank of the bioeconomy. And they say this: what neoliberalism seeks to make available is not merely a permanent surplus of labour power, but also a surplus of reproductivity, a reserve of low-cost suppliers of reproductive services and tissues who perform unacknowledged reproductive labour within the lowest echelon of the bioeconomy. And if you look at the Indian and the Latin American and the Eastern European cases, that does look pretty convincing. It works a lot less well for US college students, however, and there is quite a substantial market there as well. So perhaps not so good there. A modern non-Marxist version of the objective standard of exploitation is offered by Arlen Wertheimer. And for him, exploitation essentially means extracting a non-standard price from either the buyers of the goods or the sellers of the labour. That's an important point, that the buyers can be exploited as well. Now, the problem with this, it's subjective, good, but in biotechnology markets, there are typically no firm standard prices yet. It's too early. So if you're going to define it this way, it doesn't work as well as it does in the classic Marxist model for factory goods. The markets are still too undeveloped. the prices that buyers are willing to pay are too variable. In the US egg markets, for example, they vary between the official professional recommendation of about $5,000 per cycle to up to $75,000. And they depend on things like hair color, whether the woman is musical, SAT scores, you know. So it's a highly differentiated market depending on variance in the phenotype, which may have absolutely nothing to do with the genotype. But that is what willing buyers want to see. So I think that is less useful. It would leave regulation lagging behind if you always had to wait to see what the market shake down to calling the standard price. There's also the problem of commodity fetishism. And this, again, is a Marxist concept, but not used exclusively by Marx. The American commentator Kieran Healy, who's actually in favor of tissue markets, says that capitalist markets lead people to believe that commodities possess value in their own right, rather than because of the social labor that goes into them. And if you look at that nature definition about whether eggs possess value, you can see that that completely ignored the labor that went into producing the eggs. It simply said, well, thousands perish unfertilized every month, therefore it has no value. And in an article I wrote called The Lady Vanishes, which was about the way in which women's eggs were ignored in the story about Hwang Woo-suk. If you remember, Hwang Woo-suk was the Korean professor who claimed to have produced 11 stem cell lines, personalized stem cell lines, using a technique called somatic cell nuclear transfer, which requires huge numbers of women's eggs. In all of the coverage, which was initially ecstatic, there was absolutely no mention of the fact that women's eggs were involved. There were just a few of us sort of waving our arms around and saying, but, he must have used women's eggs. And it turned out that he had used 2,200 eggs. And he had created precisely 0 successful stem cell lines, so they were all wasted. And there was little or no recognition at the time of this phenomenon. It came out later. Okay, another difficulty, I think, with establishing a fair price for tissue, if we go into this Wertheimer model of exploitation, in which you've got to establish a standard price. Another difficulty, I think, in defining what price, if any price, is fair, is the muddiness of the distinction in tissue markets between objects external to ourselves and that which is a part of us. Modern biotechnology has blurred the line between things external and things internal. So that, for example, a mechanical ventilator can be incorporated into my body, or a pacemaker can be incorporated into my body, while parts of my body, such as a DNA swab or a blood sample, could be removed from me and disaggregated. And that creates problems in terms of commodification and objectification. It also creates practical problems. You may be familiar with the scandal which occurred about 10 years ago in the UK, the Alderhay Hospital scandal, in which a pathologist retained large amounts of tissue without the consent of the parents, and the tissue was from their dead children. In one case, he retained a whole brain of an 11-year-old without permission. So the public was outraged about this, and it led to a commission called the Retained Organs Commission being appointed, which got very much bogged down in the question of what tissue retained the identity of the donor. If you have something as simple as a tissue block or a slide, is that still the donor's tissue? Does it require consent? So these problems, I think, are quite major. There is also a problem in terms of use value and exchange value. Marx distinguished between attributing use value to something, objectifying it, and additionally making it an object of exchange, commodifying it. Objectification is just the process by which something external to ourselves is made to satisfy our wants and needs. It's not inherently wrong. It's just necessary to sustain life. Some analysts contend that Marx viewed commodification by contrast as wrong in itself. Others assert that neither objectification nor commodification is intrinsically wrong in Marx or anywhere else. But what is wrong is making a saleable object out of something that should be treated as having value in itself, irrespective of what use is made of it. Now, the factory goods that were Marx's primary focus did not have such value in themselves, only insofar as they satisfied human needs. But human beings, and possibly their body parts, do have such value in themselves. And this, I think, leads us naturally into a second notion of exploitation, which is concerned with dignity rather than disparity. And this is really more of a Kantian explanation, derives from Kant. So unless I conceive of my body and its tissues purely instrumentally as radically exterior to myself, and that is a position which Marx would probably have called alienated, there are objections to my selling my tissues that really have very little to do with what I'm paid for them, with whether they fetch a price that fairly reflects the labour that I've put into providing them. And if I sell my eggs or my kidney, then I am objectifying those parts of my body and additionally commodifying them. To Kant, that is the problematic stage. That is, by commodifying them, I'm turning them into something which is beneath my dignity. And that is true whatever price is offered. And I think that's really quite a crucial argument, which is why I've put it in bold. That is, another way of putting this objection from dignity and of viewing exploitation in terms of dignity is to ask the prior question of whether bodies and their parts are the sorts of things that have value in themselves beyond the realm of commerce. If human tissue cannot be turned into a commodity without harming people's worth as persons, then any form of tissue sale, including but not exclusive to female tissue such as eggs, is in a sense exploitative whatever price is offered for it. In the Kantian view, that is because the categorical imperative, a particular formulation of it that insists that we must never treat others merely as means, is violated by this. It's inherently degrading to human beings as subjects who have dignity and value in themselves to be treated as commodities, because commodities are mere means. Now, I think it's quite interesting to speculate when people deny that they're being exploited, whether it's something to do with their sense of dignity. And I think often it probably is. That is, even when there's a huge disparity between what they put in and what they get out, they often deny that they're being exploited. And in Robert Tressel's iconic novel of the skilled British working class, The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists, the protagonist, who's called Frank Owen, is constantly running up against his workmates' fierce antipathy to the notion that they're being exploited. They're skilled painters and decorators, and they keep having their wages lowered. With each house that they decorate or paint, they get a lower rate. And Owen sets out in clear monetary terms the way in which they're actually subsidizing their employer, Mr. Sweater. And that's why they're called philanthropists, because they're actually giving to the employer rather than the other way around. And they keep denying it. And he finally concludes that actually their last resort in the face of these continual assaults on their dignity is to assert that their very dignity requires them to accept their lot. Their dignity as skilled craftsmen requires them to accept the conditions of their labour. Similarly, there was a UK study of women enrolled on an egg-sharing scheme, that is, by which women agree to surrender a portion of their eggs for their own IVF and give them to another woman, using the language of sharing. It's actually barter. I mean, let's be frank, this is not altruism, this is barter. Okay, so it's money, but just not exchanging hands, but monetary value is involved. So this study found that women obtaining IVF at a reduced price, because they had agreed to share their eggs, typically rejected the language of exploitation, and yet they also described themselves as desperate. They used the language of desperation. Now, because there is widespread non-compliance in the UK with the official recommendation that all women should receive 3 free cycles of IVF, that is, all infertile women, these women had no other means of obtaining IVF except by part exchanging their eggs. They professed a sense of free choice, but they insisted they didn't want to give up any of their eggs. So it seems contradictory. Can you say they're exploited? Well, I think possibly you can, but in the sense of dignity, because they felt that they were reclaiming a sense of agency and dignity by claiming that they were not being exploited. It's speculative, but I think interesting. There is a third explanation or conceptualization of exploitation, and that is in terms of degradation, which I just want to draw your attention to. Ruth Sample has defined exploitation as the act of reaping unfair benefit from conditions which fail to recognize the inherent worth of another and which thereby degrade the other. And Sample asserts that this is consistent with Marx's account of exploitation in terms of disparity, but it's more moralized. It's a thicker concept, by which I mean it has more moral content. The other is more of an economic concept. Now, she seems therefore to agree that Marx does not regard commodification as inherently good or bad, and she adds an element which makes it bad, basically. I think this is interesting in terms of surrogacy, the notion of degradation. Recently, there was a study done of surrogacy clinics in Gujarat, and these clinics look to us very exploitative. They confine the women for the full 9 months of their pregnancy. They're not allowed to leave the hospital premises. Typically, the women receive about $2,000. The US couples commissioning them are told that they're receiving $7,000. I saw a film about this, which was very interesting, because the US couple firmly believed that the woman was being paid $7,000. She was getting $2,000. And in addition, the US couple was paying the egg broker. So the couple was also being exploited, actually. So it looks extremely exploitative. The women are only allowed to leave the premises for hospital checkups. They're confined to an upper floor room with 8 or 10 single iron beds and barely enough room to walk between them. Isn't this exploitative? Well, if you ask the women, some of them say no. And the one who, I found the most problematic was the one who said, no, this is a lot less exploitative than my regular job. My regular job is crushing glass for 15 hours a day. I prefer this. And I asked an Indian colleague about this, and she confirmed what I thought was probably the case, that in India, glass crushing is done by Dalits or untouchables. So that is the lowest class, the most degraded class. That work is inherently polluting and degrading, and that's why surrogacy is less degrading than that. So only by understanding exploitation with this additional component of degradation, I think, can you really formulate a response to the woman's statement that she's not being exploited. Degradation, however, is a far more subjective concept than the objective Marxist criterion, and yet it does seem necessary to add it in so that you can in some way cope with that argument that the Indian woman was making. The British philosopher Heather Widdows has said that it's exploitative and even coercive to take advantage of someone's lack of other choices. And I think this is important, because what we also need to build into any concept of exploitation are elements of power and subordination. And in this respect, Marx is not sufficient, because Marx tends to view exploitation first. And all of these situations, like the Dalit woman, or let's look at some of the women in Romania, for example, involve subordination, either gender subordination or class subordination or economic subordination. And the Australian philosopher Carol Pateman has said this is the difficulty with Marx's account in general, that he does not consider the priority of gender subordination, which precedes the economic exploitation. Okay, I now want to move on to choice and autonomy. It seems to me that too often the concept of payment is used to close down the discussion between gender subordination, before gender subordination and exploitation can even be considered. And you've heard this argument, I'm sure, many, many times. It's a very naive and simplistic argument in my view, but it goes like this. The woman has been paid, that's the end of the argument. She accepted the price, that's it. She made a choice, fine. That's all we need to know. Maybe we want to make sure that she's paid a fair price, maybe not. She's accepted that price, that's good enough. That's how the argument goes. It's quite interesting that that is widely assumed. Michal Nauman, who I was speaking about earlier, the sociologist, the Israeli sociologist who's done work in Romania, says that she very much now regrets having done her ethnographic work, beginning with asking the women why they chose to donate their eggs. She made the assumption that they'd chosen, and she now regrets that. I think this is a prime instance of what the British philosopher Francis Bacon, the 17th century philosopher, calls the idols of the marketplace. And in his Novum Organum, Bacon identifies 4 different kinds of idols, which represent fixations of the mind. These are concepts that are unthinkingly venerated beyond their due, beyond their sell-by date. And coming at the start of the modern scientific revolution, indeed in many ways being regarded as the founder of it, philosophically, Bacon felt that unless we purged our thought from such fixations, we cannot make any scientific progress. We cannot have rational debate, and we cannot make any scientific progress. Among his 4 idols of the tribe, the cave, the theatre, and the marketplace, the idols of the marketplace, I think, are particularly appropriate. They represent concepts and words which have come to be endowed with a false significance because they facilitate the easy exchange of ideas. And when the idols of the marketplace dominate, people substitute words for thought. And they feel they've won an argument when they've used the magic words to the most telling effect. When philosophers, lawyers, and policymakers, for example, try to outflank each other by deploying supposedly knockdown arguments about free choice, autonomy, and reproductive freedom, then Bacon's idols of the marketplace are receiving their libations and sacrifices. Here's an example of that kind of argument. This is from the Oxford philosopher Julian Savulescu. To ban a market in organs, let me read the quote, to ban a market in organs is paradoxically to constrain what people can do with their own lives. Okay, that's meant to be the end of the argument. You're meant to say, oh dear, I didn't think about that. Choice, of course. Obviously, can't say anything more. I give up. That's what you're supposed to say. I'm not going to say that. So constraining choice is utter anathema in this argument, and there is presumably nothing more to say. Now, it might be objected that even John Stuart Mill, who was the prophet of choice, the prophet of liberalism, recognized that there have to be some constraints on what I as an individual am allowed to choose or do in order to avoid trespassing on others' rights to manage their own lives. So that this very narrowly individualistic concept of reproductive choice, reproductive freedom, is very blind to the rights of others, and particularly, for example, to those who may be exploited, like egg donors. Another example of this attempt to use choice as a knockdown argument was found in an announcement by the UK HFEA that following a public consultation, it was retracting its previous position. Previously, women were not allowed to donate eggs for medical research, only for IVF. And after a supposed consultation, the HFEA said, given that the medical risks for donating for research are no higher than for treatment, we have concluded that it is not for us to remove a woman's choice of how her donated eggs should be used. Given that the consultation document was titled Donating Eggs for Research, Protecting Donors, not Donating Eggs for Research, Should It Be Permitted, you might think the HFEA had made its own choice already. I think it had. So what was driving the announcement was pressure from the IVF clinics and not women's choice. Women were not queuing to donate. I think it is important to note that when choice is used in this way, it is used in a rather coercive manner, a rather censorious manner. To quote again from Heather Widdows, she said, as a result, it becomes impossible to critique any practices if someone, anyone, has chosen it, as to do this is apparently to deny or undermine someone's autonomy. Not surprisingly, ethicists have often given up on wider critiques and simply sought to ensure that choice is as informed and genuine as possible. It is this silencing and trumping which is so destructive in the choice model. Now, I don't mean that there is no place for choice. Of course I don't mean that. The emphasis on respecting individual choice was foundational to liberalism, and it was originally liberating, as Mill enunciated it in On Liberty. It was meant to be a liberating critique, an instrument for social justice. But more widely and more typically now, it is used in a manner that actually fits the purposes of global neoliberalism and is too individualistic. The Iranian philosopher Zahra Maghani has argued that we must consider individual choices in the context of global neoliberalism and its policies of privatization, deregulation, and commodification, rather than relying on an apolitical, one-size-fits-all argument like choice. We have to look at the particular conditions in particular countries. And for example, in Pakistan, there has recently been ethnographic work done by anthropologists interviewing kidney sellers. And these studies have uniformly found that the kidney sellers very much regret having had to sell their kidneys. They viewed the choice as forced. They felt they had very little choice because they were under pressure from creditors and feudal landlords. One of them now says he regards himself as only half a man. And the authors of this study think that Westerners who come in and say, oh, but they chose to accept the price, are being cynical and narrow in their view, ignoring the justice issues. This is not just unique to the Third World. Even in the US, the economic downturn is forcing many women to sell their eggs, producing what is actually a buyer's market. Okay, so if we want to understand Kant rightly, I think we really need to go back and look at Kant, both in terms of exploitation and autonomy. The emphasis on autonomy and choice is usually said to be a Kantian one. It's usually said to derive from Kant. But Kant very specifically denies that autonomy applies to trading body tissue. And he says that to treat the body as a fungible object is to treat the provider not as an autonomous member of the kingdom of ends, which all persons should be treated as, but merely as a means, even if the person gives their consent. So if you're looking to Kant to justify your emphasis on choice, you won't find it in Kant. You'll find the opposite. In particular, Kant was very concerned to combat the notion in Hobbes, in Thomas Hobbes, when Hobbes wrote, "The value or worth of a man is, as of all other things, his price. That is to say, so much as would be given for the use of his power. As in other things, so in men. Not the seller, but the buyer determines the price." Now, Kant opposed this view. He objected to this formulation because it implies that different people have different values. And if we look at the US women who are selling their eggs, the blonde, tall, musical, athletic ones obviously command higher prices. And that is to imply that people have different values in the Hobbesian model. Kant objects to that because it contradicts the categorical imperative, and it undermines the equality of respect which autonomy actually demands. And therefore, these highly differentiated markets do imply that women with certain phenotypes are more valuable than others, and they fail to respect the Kantian criterion. So how do we respect the Kantian criterion? Well, the only way in which everyone, all sellers, can be treated as having the same price is if they have no price. Okay? So it's only by everyone donating that we can treat everyone equally in a Kantian framework. And personally, I think that is absolutely crucial, because it's the reason why donation is okay and sale is not. Very often you will get people who are in favour of egg sales or organ sales more generally saying, well, you think you have a property in your kidney or your eggs, right? You're allowed to donate it, or your blood. That proves that you have a property, and therefore you can sell it as well. Well, you might want to go back to the Kantian formulation and say, no, that doesn't necessarily work, because with sale you're implying that some people are worth more than others, and some people are worth less than others. But you might also want to look at the notion of property in jurisprudence, and I've looked at this at great length in Body Shopping, so I won't go into it too much here. There are certain property rights which can be differentiated. For example, I have a property in my vote. I possess it, I'm allowed to control it, but I'm not allowed to sell it. So merely to say that I have a property right in, let's say, my eggs or whatever, doesn't mean that I would necessarily be allowed to sell them. Okay, I'm going to move on to two popular but false statements and begin to wind up fairly soon. Again, you will have seen these statements quite a lot. It amazes me that you see them so much because they're obviously fatuous. They're obvious fallacies, but you do see them and they're very influential. Whatever we do, we have chosen to do, and whatever choices we make deserve respect. And you've seen these, I'm sure, a million times. Okay, how have these come to be the idols of the bioethical marketplace? How have the ideas of choice, autonomy, and reproductive freedom taken on the status of an ideology or even a religion? Well, there are various sort of sociological answers to this. To some extent, the elevation of these idols was well-intentioned. It was praiseworthy to want to extend patient autonomy and choice in the old-style hierarchical medical environment. I have no problems with that. I'm entirely in favour of that. Just as Mill was right in his desire to extend agency and rights to subordinated groups such as women. But as the corporate dominance of medicine and research gathered pace, liberal bioethicists, like progressives in other areas, lost the plot. And the US progressive activist Marcy Donofsky has written that when liberalism refuses to take a moral stance and excludes ethics from public policy, it loses the ability to offer resistance to the corporate state and market forces. That's part of what I tried to do in Body Shopping, was to demonstrate how that has happened. And also Harriet Washington's new book, Deadly Monopolies, I would recommend as a very incisive critique of corporate dominance of biotechnology. There was another issue in the United States where these trends were the most advanced, and that was the abortion wars. So the dominance of the idols of the marketplace can best be understood, most US analysts think, in terms of abortion politics. I think it's a lot more difficult to see why they're so dominant in the UK. But in the US, because the abortion debates revolved around choice, and those progressives who were in favour of women's rights to abortion framed that right in terms of choice, they found themselves challenged when they were then asked, well, don't women also have a right to choose to sell their eggs or to become surrogate mothers? And they didn't really have a reply to that because they felt it would undermine their reliance on the choice argument in the abortion debate. So it played into the hands of the corporate interests in this case. Okay. I think we're now coming to the position where women's rights advocates are increasingly troubled by the way into which they've been co-opted into worshipping the idols of choice, autonomy, and reproductive freedom. And I think we need practical alternatives. What are they? Okay, I want to end by suggesting a few possible alternatives. It does seem to me that the new reproductive technologies have genuinely extended opportunities for previously infertile people, those who can afford them in paying systems, but that the unthinking use of the rhetoric of choice has enabled the fertility industry to develop unfettered and leaves us ethically vulnerable. That's a quote from Francine Coteau of the Pro-Choice Alliance for Responsible Research in the US. But it is often said that we have no practical alternative, that we have no choice about the predominance of choice, as it were. As the example of France has suggested, I think that's not necessarily true. I think that's unnecessarily supine. So, in conclusion, it is often said that there is no practical alternative to the laissez-faire model in the global egg trade, and we have no choice about the predominance of choice as an ideology. And it does seem to me that there is certainly a counterexample to that in France. I think there are other counterexamples, other trends, which show that there are alternatives to free markets in eggs. So, for example, even some US states are beginning to regulate and indeed ban egg sales. The state of Maryland, for example, now imposes a $10,000 fine on anyone who arranges commercial egg sales. So while we think of this as being dominant across the US, it's really only in California, which is very liberal, New York, which is quite liberal, and some other states that it is dominant. These are large and populous states, so they matter, but it's not true everywhere. Even in California, there is now a very active movement, which, interestingly enough, is being supported by the IVF industry, to get an egg donor registry going. It really is quite incredible that we have absolutely no information to give to women who want to sell their eggs as to the long-term risks. The studies that we now have are for fertile women. By definition, they're not going to be necessarily the ones that are relevant. So there is now a bill in California to mandate government warnings to egg donors and to require all the clinics to actually compile records. This is really quite major if I tell you that there was a study done in the US several years ago in which an ethnographic researcher phoned several IVF clinics and said, what are the risks? And they said things like, well, you might gain a few pounds. Really not. So the risks are not well known. Where they are known, they are not well promulgated. And it's therefore very important in an age of evidence-based medicine, when we have things like the Cochrane Collection and evidence base everywhere else, that we get an evidence base here. Because then you could at least say that women are making an informed choice if they choose to sell their eggs. And I think a lot fewer would so choose if they knew the risks. There are also models involving this idea of a biobank. That is, the American political scientist David Winnicott is using the idea of biobanks as charitable trusts. And that, I think, is again an altruistic model which could be used in egg donation. So I think there are other alternatives. I think it is unduly pessimistic to say that there are no other choices. So, reconsidering then, just closing, going back to exploitation and choice as a motive terminology or necessary critique, it does seem to me that one of them is a nuanced concept with an honourable ancestry in political theory and powerful relevance to public policy. The other is an advertising slogan. I think you can guess which I think is which. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. I think that it's also stimulating the debate. If I look at the audience, there are people from policy department, from philosophy, from gender, from legal studies and elsewhere, and also from the medical school from Budapest. And so I'm sure that there will be different reflections on your presentation, and thank you very much for unfolding concepts which we took for granted, and in several policy debates I think exploitation and both choice are used in such a manner. There are many issues which you have raised in your presentation, and I think that one of the difficulties in such debates, and we tackled that in some previous discussion, that the current landscape of biomedical law often have to interpret of human rights in a molecular level or in the level of gametes, and we are not adequately armed how to interpret that, and we often just borrow the concepts which we are known in the field of human rights, not thinking about how shall we interpret in the level of gametes and what is applicable and what is not applicable in this particular domain. And also the same thing about how we interpret, for instance, bodily integrity. And you are very perfectly right to point out that Kant was also a little bit abused in legal debates, and I think that on one hand it can be a source of human dignity, on the other hand, of course, when it's extended for autonomy, which is much later concept, even in medical ethics, we took it for granted for the same source, which we should explore. And my introductory question, I know that warming up is always more difficult. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions from the audience, especially some people I know in the audience dealing with issues of commercialization, commodification of the human body and organs and gametes. That do you say that the gender has not adequately explored in the level of gametes? You think about Evan's case and others that are constantly coming back and forth. Should we make a distinction? Should we value labor, which of course makes significant differences between the gametes in sperm and egg? And should we provide a different value, or what was taken the position in Evan case? It was a genetic concept, 50-50%. It was considered more like as a commodity. It was a case against the UK, and for instance Spain and Hungary was mentioned in a case as having a different solution than the British law, but nevertheless I think that this dimension is still unexplored. But if your thesis, as you explore the exploitation, and I think that was a very important contribution, then maybe we should take gender also into account in the level of gametes.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. If you look, for example, at the US Anatomical Gift Act of 1987, it exempts gametes from the general prohibition on sale and purchase of organs. I mean, not even in the US are you allowed to buy kidneys. But you are allowed to buy gametes, and an entire industry has grown up on this, and of course is now a very entrenched industry with massive interests, massive financial interests. And why was that exempted? Well, because gametes are renewable. Sperm is renewable, but eggs are not. And there have been a number of studies, confirming that position. There was one rogue study which did seem to prove that eggs were renewable, but that's since been dismissed by other subsequent studies. So I think it's fairly widely accepted now that a baby girl is born with a full complement of immature oocytes that she's ever going to have. And if you've ever looked at, I was on the ethics committee of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists for many years, and I remember one conference when we were actually shown pictures of the level of eggs remaining in the ovarian tissue of a 35-year-old woman, and I have to say it wasn't very high. So you do realise, how rapidly they become depleted, and therefore that if some are taken, those are gone permanently. So they're not renewable. Obviously then, gender wasn't taken into account, and biological sex in this case, rather than gender as such, was not sufficiently taken into account. I think you're also right in the Evans case. Does everyone know the Evans case? Okay, the case in which it was a case about freezing of embryos and subsequently the way in which the couple who were divorcing were unable to agree what should happen to the embryos. Under the under Section 13.5 of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act, the original one, the earlier one, it was required that both partners give their consent to any future use. and Natalie Evans went to court to try to establish, particularly because she was infertile and I think it had an operation for cancer or something like that. Yeah, ovarian cancer, I believe. That's right, yeah. She was never going to be able to produce any more eggs. So these embryos were it, as far as she was concerned. And the court said, but look at section 13.5. It's absolutely clear. There's nothing we can do about it. So yes, I think that was a failure to consider the differential impact, not merely because the woman happened, very, very unfortunately, to have had cancer, but also because of the amount of labour the woman put into the extraction of the eggs being very much greater than the amount of labour that the man put in to the production of the sperm, that again, the law, that section failed to consider gender.
Thank you very much, Kati.
Well, actually, it's almost a follow-up on this, this question, because I thought it was very interesting that you were giving different kinds of argument, and they had different scopes. For example, and I was just wondering if you would agree a certain kind of extension of your strongest argument, which I thought was your strongest argument in the sense that it would have a wider scope. You said that if people sell, if they ask a price and they ask different prices for different eggs depending on the phenotype, that is unacceptable because it commodifies them in the Kantian sense. So am I right in thinking that that would also make it impossible to sell sperm? Yeah. It's just interesting because it doesn't have sperm. Selling sperm doesn't have the other features, like it's not invasive, it's not, it's renewable, it's not even a tissue. I mean, it's just right. So it's not such an integral part of the body. So I suppose you could be liberal on those accounts. But if we really take your argument seriously, then that would be possible too.
I think in Kantian terms, yes, it would be prohibited. It would be prohibited. Well, there could be two grounds. The argument from the differential quality of it, and it is perfectly true. Again, if you look at these are 9 sperm banks, many of which are American, but not all, you do see very differentiated prices, again depending on the same factors as obtained for women, so blonde, tall, musical, athletic, etc. So Kant would object on the grounds of the anti-Hobbesian grounds about everyone not being equal. I think he would also just object on the grounds of commodification, even though less labour is involved. I don't think he would be bothered about the labour aspect, because that's more of a Lockean argument. He would be bothered about the turning of oneself into a commodity. You may remember there's a passage where he debates selling hair. Are you allowed to sell your own hair? And he says, well, all right, just about. But it's not a very noble thing to do. So he would probably just about allow it, because that is very much waste. We haven't really looked at the waste issue. Neither sperm nor eggs is waste, because they are gametes, they possess the power of creating new life. So I think probably you would find Kant would also oppose that. I certainly think that the sperm markets are not as differentiated as the egg markets, but they possess many of the same characteristics that make the egg markets untrustworthy. And there is also the additional issue, the dangerousness issue about untreated, unscreened sperm, which doesn't so much apply to eggs because you have to get those from a clinic, whereas you don't have to do that with sperm. So in terms of IVF and risk of AIDS or something of that kind, you also have that additional argument.
I think that your framework was very useful to distinguish between different types of exploitation and commodification. For instance, the issue in the dignity came also in the context of sperm harvesting, when someone was in a persistent vegetative state and was ordered to harvesting the sperm, and the dignity came also in an issue. So there are some analogies as well, so we have to not take it for granted that any kind of harvesting could constitute an exploitation, and you made a very nice analysis that from legalese and from ethical perspectives, what are those elements which should be taken into account. And there are some elements which works for the egg, and there are some elements which works for both of the gametes. Yes. Questions? Yeah. Retro, please.
Thank Petra Bart from CEU, researcher there. And I was just wondering what the ultimate legal test would be for you to allow or to disallow the sale of eggs. And then my question would be, what would be the consequences, the practical consequences of the legal test being applied? And what I have in mind particularly is the dwarf tossing case, which was also based on dignity, but in the end of the day, it was the short persons who went out to the streets and demonstrated, you know, dwarf tossing, when in front of pubs, people find it was funny to toss short persons, and the person who throws the short person the furthest is the winner. Okay, so it allegedly is kind of a sport in France and the UK, but I only know it from the literature. But anyway, there was a case concerning, a legal case concerning this practice, and it has been decided on the basis of dignity, and the consequence of the outcome of the case was the short persons going out to the streets and demonstrating since they got unemployed, and as you know, persons living with disabilities are in a difficult position on the labor market. So, you know, what is the what is the consequence of this perhaps paternalistic approach? And then also as to the universalism, localism debate that you partially addressed, some women, especially in India, do not feel to be exploited themselves. Nevertheless, according to the test that you would probably apply, they are being exploited. So how these values or differences then reconcile? This is again the same problem. You are not allowing child labor, then the children become prostitutes and so on. And then the final question would be, if you were phrasing the test around human dignity, how would that test be modified in the US context, which has a different understanding of dignity? Thank you.
Lots of questions. Those are three very big questions. I'll do the best I can. Okay. You asked what I would consider to be the ultimate legal test of sale.
If I wanted to sell my eggs, what is illegal?
Okay. I think you're phrasing that from the assumption that sale will be permitted. I don't think that that is necessarily the assumption we should proceed from. It's not the assumption the French proceeded from. And I don't think it is necessarily paternalistic to say that we shouldn't allow sale. This is perhaps to do with your second point. But it also came up in your first point. There is a general critique. I've done some study of the French National Ethics Committee. There is a critique of it as being paternalistic, and of course, you know, French institutions are typically critiqued as being very top-down, very hierarchical. The way in which the consultation was done for the most recent revision of the bill was very bottom-up. So there were 3 panels in 3 cities, none of which were Paris, and they were lengthy panels, popular panels, and they were all anti-commodification. The one in which there was the most disagreement was on surrogacy, and there is still some popular feeling in favour of allowing that, particularly following a case in which a couple tried to bring back twin babies in the boot of their car, which they had with a surrogate mother. Anyway, the general principle, I think, that it's paternalistic to forbid choice, I think is also a mistaken assumption. In many cases, you have a position where the populace as a whole is against egg sale or against commodification of the body more generally. We've had several consultations on similar subjects in the UK recently. We had one on pharmacogenetics, which I know is a slightly different area, that is direct-to-consumer genetic testing. And 70% of the respondents said that they didn't want it, but the argument was that it would be paternalistic to intervene and to forbid them to have freedom of choice. But when you have popular movements saying, we actually don't want choice, then what's paternalistic is to fly in the face of what people say they want. So I do think that the choice people have been allowed to commandeer the paternalism, the anti-paternalism argument much too easily. And I don't agree that we should necessarily let that be any more determining than the choice argument itself. Then your final question was, how would the test of sale work in the US? Okay. There are already areas of biotechnology which are regulated in the US. We tend to think of it as a total free-for-all, but it's not. So that, for example, you cannot buy and sell kidneys. Okay. Again, with things like direct-to-consumer genetic testing, half of the states forbid it. So that's, again, not allowed everywhere. I think it would work the same way that it would work everywhere, with the exception that you have a federal system. So that the argument would have to be made on a state level in most of these considerations. However, you do, in most of these questions, but you do have some institutions like the FDA, which can act on a federal level, so that the possibility of regulation through the FDA is also there. But I'm not sure if I've understood why you were asking that question, but if it's, are you assuming that the US would be more in favour of free markets than elsewhere?
Yes, I think they have.
Was that the point?
Or at least the test would be defined differently. So I am thinking about the localizing era, and then the partial overruling, or not necessarily overruling, but departing from that era, and you know how it fits into this debate of having a contract, selling something, selling my labor, and then coming the state into play, prohibiting and protecting me from myself.
Oh yes, I see. Okay, yeah. So yes, I think that in general there would be this distrust of paternalistic intervention.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, you do actually have many states which do already intervene. So that I don't think that it would necessarily be a knockdown argument to say that you mustn't regulate.
For instance, egg brokers exist in some states. In California, I've seen a very interesting logic, and they said that they had a bargaining so that the Berkeley students don't have to repeatedly sell their eggs, but they can make a better price. And there was a catalogue I myself seen in the interviews. Renata, you wanted to ask a question? Oh, sorry, that Thomas first.
Yeah, I found the use of Marx really interesting. And the use of exploitation. But Marx's theory is more than just that. So it's also a theory of social change. Exploitation is a relationship. It's a social relationship between basically those who have to sell the labor and those who buy the labor. And it's how that relationship develops. And at some point in the theory, workers become aware and they decide to change their relationship. Revolution, whatever. So what I'm trying to understand is I'm kind of actually confused. It's a good confusion. So a little thought experiment. Because you bring in Cant, you bring in the various things. What would happen if somewhere in India, a village of women realized that here's an opportunity, and in a self-aware way, what they decided to do is they decided to form their own egg co-op. And they would basically decide that they would employ people who would harvest their eggs, and they would decide to pay them. And they would decide how they were sold in the market. And the profits from those eggs would be used to benefit themselves with the good things they want to do. So what would be the moral objections using your exploitation argument for that? And specifically, who's exploiting whom? How is that relationship qualitatively different from the relationship you outlined? And is it possible to use some criteria to say this is progress, or would you say this is not progress? Because Marx would say it was progress.
Now, it's an interesting thought experiment. So what you're sort of suggesting is if something like the Grameen Bank was set up, small-scale capital.
Actually, yes.
Yeah, but it were an egg co-op instead. Would there be anything wrong with it?
Might be the only resource they have to play with.
So something like microfinance,
In a
but
sense,
in
yes.
eggs. Yeah.
Yes. Deciding to take over banking, deciding to take over yes, exactly.
Yeah, no, I understand. That's an interesting thought experiment. I mean, first of all, I have to say it's not a very realistic thought experiment in terms of where the demand is coming from. There is some demand within India for eggs, but most of the demand is coming externally, particularly for surrogacy. So whereas in the sort of Grameen Bank model, you're looking at microfinance within a single village, which is how I understood your model also to be working, that's not going to happen because there isn't going to be the demand within the single village. It's going to be...
Well, they'd be selling it on the market. They'd be playing it with the global market. They might be selling it in the US.
Okay, that's where the difficulties arise there.
Yeah.
Yeah. because that's when you begin to get the differentiated rates, that's when you begin to get the need for regulation. For example, a woman who's, let's say she's got a small loan from the Grameen Bank and is producing cloth for sale, something like that. She does it in her own home, she sets the conditions of her labour. So if we look at, in the Marxist terminology, at the conditions of production, she has considerable control over them. The women producing children for surrogacy have absolutely no control over the conditions of their labour. There is the additional difficulty with surrogacy that you're looking at egg sale. So I think we would have to confine this to eggs alone. And in that case, I think the example might fall down because I don't think you would have the external demand. But I think it's an interesting one. Why would I still want to say that that is wrong? And I think I would still want to say it's wrong. Well, a number of reasons. First of all, it's very well established that Marx was not good on gender issues. And particularly, I know I'm overstating, but that in terms of reproductive labour, Marx, first of all, did not think of reproductive labour as genuine labour. So in that sense, to use a Marxist model of a cooperative or something of that kind would not really work, because Marx strenuously denied that reproductive labour was productive labour, and therefore I think would not think there could be such a model. Secondly, I think there are the problems, the non-Marxist problems, because I did not just rely on Marx in my talk. I think there are a number of non-Marxist problems that would also arise, and I think those problems would have to do not only with degradation, because I think you'd still have a caste problem there. That is, eggs from lower caste women would be a lot less desirable than eggs from high caste women. But I think you would also have problems about, Kantian problems about turning yourself into an object of sale. And then finally, and this is just the obvious one, how are you going to do it in medical terms? You cannot, without medical intervention. You'd have to set up an IVF clinic, you'd have to have skilled personnel. How are you going to fund all this? Well, you're going to fund it by selling the eggs on the global market, and then we're going to have all of the difficulties that do arise in the existing system. So I think it's a nice idea. I just think it's impractical on a number of levels.
I'm Renata from Legal Studies, and actually I have one question somewhat on similar lines as Petra, but listening to your talk, you very much focused on the women who are the donors, but not so much on the purpose of the use and the potential recipients. And I'm wondering to what extent do the future uses and the intents of the recipients feature into your model. Mm-hmm. One concern being that if you do exclude sale altogether, an altruism-based approach has the potential in further perpetuating inequalities. So assuming, in an ideal world, this would be a global model of no sale, but to the extent it doesn't catch on, you are entering a global market, and some states can afford to be extremely nice and ethical, but actually the better situated upper class users or potential recipients will simply move to another corner of the globe to buy what they cannot buy at home. So would you be inclined to take into account who is buying and for what purpose?
Thank you. It is often said that if you ban or regulate egg sale, that it's impractical. And you've identified two reasons why it might be impractical. One, that they would simply go elsewhere. Well, we do have international regulation, so that itself is not necessarily determinative. We don't, for example, we do regulate internationally about solid organs like kidneys. And so far the only state that's defied that is Iran. So it is possible to regulate internationally and have it stick, if there's the will. What I really want to take issue with, though, is the idea that I'm ignoring the recipients, because the usual argument is that if you ban or regulate egg sale, you will not satisfy the level of demand, and people will not be able to get eggs. Infertile people will be blocked, and that this is cruel. Okay, I can understand that argument, but I don't think it's a very good argument. An altruistic system may actually be more practical than a paid system. First of all, the obvious problem with a paid system is only the infertile who can afford to pay are having their demands satisfied, unless you have a system whereby a national body, let's say a National Health Service, provides and pays for the eggs, which some people have noted, but so far we don't really have any such systems. Altruism may increase the level of donation, and that is obvious in the blood donation system. One reason the UK blood donation system works is there are people like my husband in the audience who's given 52 times now, and who says that he would not give if it were paid. He would think it was tawdry. I think that's how I understand his feelings anyway. So that can work perfectly well, which is one reason why the US system has gone over to being more altruistic, because it works better than payment. And I think the same is true with eggs, or could be true with eggs. It's certainly been true of sperm donors. For example, in Sweden, when there was a feeling that sperm donations were falling off, or too low, they changed the model of the donors. So rather than paying students, mostly young male students before, they decided to focus on older men who'd already completed their families and to focus on their desire to help other infertile couples. That's also the French model. It's seen as a donation from a fertile couple to an infertile couple. And that seems to work reasonably well. It certainly worked reasonably well in Sweden. So I do not think that an altruistic system necessarily lets down recipients. I think the opposite.
Thank you very much, and I think that it was the time we planned the debate. Thank you very much for coming and participating. I'm sorry, there is a last question.
In relation to what you were just saying, how would you actually frame it so that women would be motivated to donate? Because I have given blood many times, and from what you were saying, how the procedure is to give eggs is much more intrusive and.
Yeah.
So how would you, it has like no frame of comparison to me with giving blood, which is like half an hour and then within 24 hours you recover pretty much. So
yeah.
How would you even like frame like a campaign to like motivate people to donate? Unless they...
Okay, but that doesn't bear on sale or not. Whether it's simpler or harder, it is harder. Of course it's harder than blood donation and more risky, definitely. But the same arguments about sale versus altruism could apply with blood donation. It's not the simplicity or difficulty of it that makes the difference. What you do have already, to a sizable extent, you have some altruistic egg donation going on. I think there are problems about whether it's really done with a properly informed consent, because we don't yet have the evidence base as to the long-term risks. But I'm not opposed to altruistic egg donation, provided that the woman does realise what the risks are. And again, if the model is conceived as donation from a fertile couple or woman to an infertile, then I think, given that you do already have some altruistic donation going on in many countries, including in the UK, that you will continue to do so. So I don't think that it's necessarily going to drive all altruism out of the system if we simply ban sale. I think it may even increase it.
Thank you very much, and I think that it was a very nice closing word and defense for altruism. Thank you very much for being with us, and I think that it was an excellent presentation, and you could see it from very different departments people could follow, and that's also developing a kind of common language and cross-cultural disciplines and between different units and departments of the university. And of course we can continue the debate under less formal circumstances in front of the auditorium for a small reception. And please, again, on behalf of all, I would like very much thank you for coming here and to give it this exciting presentation. Thank you.